pictures of it, what it looks like, its leaves, its little fruit, smelly white flowers that I do not like, but they are pretty, and I can see why it gets propagated and used so much. So it's very popular for planting in urban areas along streets. It's a garbage tree for that because it just falls apart right away, but it is very quick to establish, and so people like that. They like that it's pretty, they like the shape, but it does not last for very long, and it invades areas around that. And since birds can carry the seeds, they can take it pretty far. So right there, it's got a lot of the characteristics we just talked about. The birds carry the seeds, they can disperse them. It colonizes rapidly. It is obviously tolerant of different habitats if it's growing along streets and out in old field sites and just about wherever. So a few of those characteristics. So invasive plants, shrubs are another major issue in this area. So bush honeysuckle, multiflora rose, autumn olive, all of these shrubby things that are in the understory. I'm specifically talking about forested areas now, and can prevent regeneration from happening, prevent trees from growing into bigger trees. They can kind of crowd out a lot of the native species that we care about in that area. So that's why they're a problem. I am sure you have seen bush honeysuckle. You have seen tons of bush honeysuckle. You've talked about in your classes, and we'll probably remove some bush honeysuckle on Friday. There are actually many different species of bush honeysuckle. What we call invasive bush honeysuckle is actually a whole set of different ornamental honeysuckles that were introduced, as well as some that are kind of more looked at for erosion control, some really showy flowered ones. Looks different in different seasons, but right now and into the fall, it's one of the last to lose its leaves in the fall, the first to get them in the spring. So it allows it to photosynthesize for a longer period than some native competitors. It's got tons of red berries that are spread by birds. It tolerates a really wide variety of sites. It will crowd out others. So a lot of those common invasive characteristics. I wanted to show this one, burning bush, because it's another invasive shrub that is a problem in Kentucky. It's increasingly a problem in Kentucky, but it's super popular in ornamental planting still. So you will see, Lowe's and everywhere else carry this. You can buy it everywhere, from what I can tell. It's used in new plantings all the time, and it is beautiful. You cannot argue with that. Look at this. This is gorgeous. No wonder people want to plant it. But it basically does the same thing in the understory as bush honeysuckle. It's not as big of a problem here as bush honeysuckle, but it is in other places. And there are sites in the area where it is a major problem. So just something to keep in mind, that the ornamental industry is really key for a lot of this. In some states, so if you were to go to Ohio, you probably couldn't buy a lot of the species that we're talking about today. It is not legal to sell them. Kentucky does not have any of those regulations, and I don't foresee it happening in the near future. So I think the thing to do is to get it on people's radar. The people who are purchasing those, that's not what they want. There's no demand for that. Because the only reason that Lowe's and other places sell them is because people want to buy them. So to me, that's kind of the strategy for our region to reduce some of that. But here's some more pictures of that winged burning bush. So invasive vines, we talked about kudzu. There are many invasive vines that are problematic. Japanese honeysuckle, a relative of the bush honeysuckle, wonderful smelling flowers, but will just kind of take over areas. Winter creeper is one that I'm going to talk about because we are going to see some tomorrow, and you've probably seen a ton at the Arboretum, at Raven Run, at other places you've gone. So have all of them talked to you about winter creeper removal being a major effort for them? Yeah, so it's really challenging to remove. I mean, some of you, I see some smiles. Are some of you removing it? Are you working on it, or?
I have before.
Yeah. Okay. What'd you do?
What?
How'd you try to do it?
The way they were combating it, it was basically pulling it up, and if there was any like smaller stem pieces left, they were like kind of dabbing it with some chemicals.
Yep.
Similar to, I think, honeysuckle process.
Yep, a combination of mechanical removal and chemical application. Because if you leave any of that root in there, it's going to come back.
Yeah.
which is a problem. And it's also commonly sold everywhere and really popular. I took this picture, I don't know, right at like a shopping center near campus. So it's everywhere. And you have seen this. You know what it's doing in the understory. It's just taken over, forming a really dense mat, preventing other native species from thriving there. When you remove it, you will find some of those native species coming back, some of those spring ephemerals returning pretty rapidly, which is exciting. But until then, you're not going to see a lot because everything is coated with bush honey or winter creeper. So carpets the forest floor, it grows up trees as a vine, and that's where it is sexually reproductive. So it does not produce flowers, it does not produce seeds unless it is growing up as a vine. So a lot of people's kind of first management strategy is to cut the vines, prevent them from fruiting and flowering, and then try to deal with everything that's on the floor. So I wanted to mention an herbaceous species, so we can kind of move into those that you probably haven't seen. Has anybody heard of this, Japanese chayflower? So we've talked a lot about the things that are already out there, and they're already a big problem. But there are many that we don't currently have, but some of our neighbors do, or they are kind of encroaching on this area. So this is one of them, Japanese chayflower. You can see its current distribution. And it was really recently arrived to Kentucky, right here, the Ohio River kind of area, right on the border. Major issue already in Indiana and Illinois, both in riparian areas, bottomland forest, field edges, and uplands. So it's got a huge habitat range. So for me, when I look at this map and I hear that, I'm like, whoa, this is a major concern because it's right here, it's right in our backyard, basically. It's likely in many more sites than are listed here. It's not like a lot of people go out and do this invasive species reporting. So it's probably spread further than that. It has the potential to impact a really huge area. So all of these things are quite concerning for me. So that's when I start looking for something some more. So it forms dense monoculture, shading and outcompeting others. Nothing new there. A lot of the invasives that we talk about are doing that. It has these spikes. I don't know if you can see it. To me, it's a little bit distinctive, although there are some native species that do look a little similar. It has an opposite leaf arrangement with little red nodes there. It can grow quite tall, but typically is a little shorter. So it's more of the herbaceous type of plant that will sprout up each year, and has these small, not really noticeable flowers in spikes. And these in turn produce lots of seeds, and each of those seeds have these stiff bracts on them that will stick to hair and clothing and equipment and get around. So it's pretty inconspicuous, it's easy to spread, and it's right on our border, like right encroaching on Kentucky. So something to look out for. And here's another one to look out for. Have any of you seen this? Yeah, you've seen it?
Yeah, once before.
Where?
At a family farm, actually. I think it was outside of Danville somewhere.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Good to know.
I think that's what it was.
Yeah? Okay, so it very well might be in Kentucky. I don't know of any in Kentucky yet, but it very well might, right? Because you don't know until somebody finds it and you report it. And it's confirmed. There are some things that look a little similar to this. This is giant hogweed, and it is huge. But right now, it's thought to kind of be more in this area, although I think it's spreading. So it's scattered around. It was actually introduced for horticultural purposes, like ornamentally, because it's giant. It's like a giant, big, what does this look like to you? Like a Queen Anne's lace or something in the carrot family. Really beautiful. But it's concerning because it's huge. It can grow up to 15 feet tall. But check this guy out. I mean, he looks really cool and all, but he's wearing a ton of protective equipment, right? So that probably tells you something about this plant. If he's wearing eye covering and a hat and gloves and long sleeves. There's something going on with this plant. So the main reason why people don't like it and are concerned about it is because it has great phytotoxicity. So the sap from this plant makes your skin very sensitive to light, and you can get pretty severe burns really rapidly.
Because of that, I'm very surprised to hear you say it's an ornamental plant.
Right? I know, I don't know who had it as an ornamental plant, but someone introduced it intentionally. And it's in some formal gardens in England. You can find it there. Like, you know, look at this specimen, this gorgeous specimen. And I think that the seeds are actually a like common spice in Middle Eastern foods. So, you know, several pathways through which this could have gotten here. But at least in England, it is an ornamental plant for some of those formal gardens, but clearly not something anybody wants in their fields because it would be a pain to remove. If this squirted up in your eye or something, it can cause blindness. If you've got a team of volunteers trying to help you remove invasive plants, you don't want to ask anybody to take this out. So that's, you know, a major problem. So that's why it's kind of on the list. So far, most of what we've talked about has been for environmental reasons. This one, I haven't really heard of it being a major environmental issue, but clearly it's a problem for people, and people do not want it spreading around. So there's some other species like that. So fire ants, you know, they have environmental impacts, but the reason why we don't want them to spread tends to have more to do with their impact to people than their ecological impacts. So these are just some more pictures of this giant hogweed, so you can see. So there are many more. This is just a small number of them, but I do want to mention some other invasive species. So how common are invasive plants across Kentucky? Extremely common. So this map isn't even particularly new, but this is the number of different invasive plant species by county in Kentucky. So you can see all of them have them, and some of them have many. And this is, I'm sure, out of date. So you could double those numbers. So, yeah.
Focused around population centers.
Oh, yes, focused around population centers. So areas where people are. We like to bring in new ornamentals, and we like to spread things around. So definitely. We are the major corridor. So insects, you know about emerald ash borer. You know a lot about emerald ash borer, so I'm going to skip over some of this. Last time you were at Floorcliff, did they talk with you about emerald ash borer? What did they tell you about? Okay, somebody, come on.
Well, they pointed out a tree that had it.
Pointed out a tree that had it. Have you all seen damage from an emerald ash borer? We're going to see some more, I'm sure. So it is an invasive insect that has wiped out most of our ash. Will continue to do so, especially of the green and white ash species. So a major issue. I wanted to show you a different invasive insect that we don't currently have. This is spotted lanternfly. Have any of you heard of this species? Oh, wonderful. Okay, not all of you though. Okay, so I think it's beautiful, and this is kind of its favorite host. So this is tree of heaven, which I mentioned earlier because it's an invasive species. And if it just stayed on tree of heaven, that would be fine and great, and we'd love that, and just, you know, do its thing and be a biological control for tree of heaven. But of course, it won't do that. So it affects basically all of the hardwood species, so your maples, oak, poplar, sycamore, walnut, willow, pine trees, as well as fruit trees, grapes, agricultural crops, so a huge host range. So we talked about lots of different habitat types, preferences, so this one has a huge host range. And you can see these are its eggs. They're kind of pretty well disguised. It'll even cover them up with this waxy substance so you can't notice them. It'll lay them on just about anything from equipment and cars to tree trunks. So you could easily accidentally spread them around and move them long distances. These are what the nymphs look like at different stages. Initially they're black and white, and then they're kind of this red, black, and white spotted color. And then they turn into these lovely moths. And this is why people are concerned about them, because they are very gregarious and will feed extensively. on plants and suck the sap from them, so they are true bugs, and will kind of coat things. And you can't see the base here, but it's just totally covered with these moths feeding off of these trees. So draining the nutrients, draining the resources from those trees or grapes or whatever it is that they're feeding on. So right now it's pretty limited in scope, so it's not a lot of places, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New York, Virginia, but obviously people are concerned about what's going to happen when it's going to spread, because it is going to spread. It's going to spread of its own accord, you know, moving itself, but we're probably going to unintentionally spread it long distances. And we have lots of hosts that are susceptible and can be hurt by this. So animals, I'm going to just rush through this. Starlings, they are everywhere, introduced by us because somebody really thought all the trees that all the animals that Shakespeare talked about needed to be in the park here in North America. So, you know, I'm sure they had great intentions, but it was not good. So there are tons of them. They damage agriculture, native species, spread diseases, contribute to the decline of native birds. So even though they are everywhere, they are a major problem. Feral hogs I wanted to put up here because we don't have a problem with feral hogs right now, but a lot of places in the southeast have a huge problem with these things. They will rip up agricultural areas. They are destructive. They cause billions of dollars of damage annually.
Kentucky State's forestry.
They are, but they're not. They're pretty contained. So they have some small populations. So they do not cause really extensive damage, but in some areas they are just out of control and people can't control them. They can't kind of deal with all the damage that they're doing. So pathogens, you've already talked about chestnut blight fungus, right? I'm seeing a lot of heads shaking that you knew what that was. So I'm going to skip over some of that. But just to mention, you can see some pictures here. This is a fungus, so it's not the kind of fungus that produces mushrooms. That's about the biggest mushrooms you're ever going to get from that fungus, but nonetheless it causes death of chestnuts. Maybe we found a way around it, but who knows. So you've probably also heard of white nose. It is a different fungal disease that affects bats. Widespread mortality of bats, lots of different bat species affected. So fungi can also affect humans. You know, the invasive bacteria, viruses, fungi can have a wide host range, plants, animals, humans, whatever. So what can we do to stop invasive species? We talked about invasion as a process. So this is kind of the cost of control, and this is the time after the arrival of something. And this is to indicate the area that is infested, the kind of how much area is infested by some invasive organism. And obviously this exact curve or plot isn't going to match for everything, but the gist is right in that it is way easier to stop something from being introduced to begin with, or to, as soon as it's detected, if you can, you know, find it and eradicate it locally, your money is better spent doing that, because a little can go a long way if you can prevent it from establishing, because it's not, you know, around everywhere. Once you get over here to where something is really widespread, you are never going to be able to eradicate that. Your best option is local management and control where appropriate for your purposes. So it's all about prioritizing funds and resources to do that. So where we're going to go on Friday, Floricliff, they are never going to be able to prevent bush honeysuckle and winter creeper and other species from arriving. They are everywhere. What they are trying to do is to locally manage in priority areas to have the type of forest they want. They're never going to be able to not have that as a problem in the future. They're always going to have invasive species coming in. So the best time to do any of this is really early on, which unfortunately, typically you don't even know about something being a problem until we're over here. And eradication is unlikely or impossible, and your best hope is to try to reduce something's spread, buy yourself some time to develop a management strategy for it and work with landowners to kind of get them geared up for what they can do. That being said, what can we do to stop invasives? We can prevent their arrival to begin with, so that's the best time to do it. So if you ever see signs about not moving firewood and other things, that's because people don't want to spread insects and diseases that might potentially be invasive. There are some times when you know they're invasive organisms. You don't want to spread Asian longhorn beetle. So that's a major invasive potential problem. We don't want to spread it. So if you're in a quarantine zone, you cannot spread wood from that area. But just in general, you don't know what's out there, what's going to be the next emerald ash borer. So that's why we want people to use firewood locally instead of spreading it around unless it is properly treated. You can eradicate when it's possible. Usually, by the time you notice something's a problem, it's well past being able to eradicate something. At that point, you're talking about containing an issue, mitigating its damage, and there's some ways to inform you all as kind of master naturalists what you can tell people who are hiking, who are camping, who are boating, maybe who are gardeners, to reduce the potential chance that they could propagate something that's invasive and spread it around. So those are good things to know about. So before you go, I'm just going to touch on common removal techniques. So we talked about mechanical removal, pulling things up. This could also be mowing. It could be grazing. You could bring animals in there to do this for you. Chemical treatment. When people talk about chemical treatment of plants, that is herbicide. So you can do that in different ways. You can spray it on the leaves. You can cut something and spray the little stump that's left. You can hack into a tree and spray that wound that you've made. There are lots of different ways of doing that, but the reason people use chemical treatments is because if you don't do this, you can't kill the roots, and invasive plants actually don't. Many of them will grow back even stronger than they were initially if you cut them back and leave them without killing the root system. So it's not that people love using a bunch of herbicides in their woodlands and sensitive areas, kind of Floorcliff. I'm sure if they could get away with doing this without herbicide, they'd rather do that because it's cheaper. And they don't want to have non-target effects. But that's what they do because it's the most effective way to remove those invasive species. There are some other things that are out there that sometimes people will use, but most of it is mechanical removal, chemical treatment. That's the gist of this. So everything is going to depend on your site. What you do depends on what you have, and so we're going to talk more about that on Friday. So I have given Carmen some of these resources. I think they're up there, and if they're not, they are all on a Google Drive folder. This is a really good new book that just came out, New Invaders of the Southeast. If this is something you're interested in, this has a lot of those species that aren't here yet, but could get here. If you're more interested in, I know about these, I want to know how to manage the ones I already have, this is a fabulous book that goes through every single invasive plant that you might see a problem in this area and exactly what formulations you use, how do you treat it. So there's a lot of resources that are out there. For your homework, what you're going to be doing, let me skip over this, is to find and identify some invasive plants. You're going to do this with iNaturalist. And then you're going to look at the map for those species on EdMaps. EdMaps is what land managers and first responders typically use to report these species. However, their apps are just not very fun to use, so I did not assign you using their apps. I saved you that, so you can use iNaturalist. Everything that goes into iNaturalist eventually is pipelined into EdMaps. It takes some time, but it does happen, so that's what you'll be doing. Sound good? Any questions?
All right. Friday, be at the band, 8:50 as normal.